I asked my father-in-law to help me zip my dress, and what happened next changed everything. What would you do if a simple favor uncovered feelings you never expected? Stay tuned as I unravel this forbidden tale of secrets, tension, and impossible choices. Let me know where you're watching from. I asked my father-in-law to help me zip my dress, and he pulled off my... The words echoed in my mind as I stood frozen in front of the mirror, the air between us thick with tension. His hands lingered, brushing against my bare back, the heat of his touch radiating through the thin fabric. It was supposed to be an innocent moment, a quick favor while I rushed to get ready for the evening's family dinner. My husband, Jake, was already downstairs, entertaining his siblings, oblivious to the charged atmosphere unfolding in our bedroom. "Let me get that for you," Richard, my father-in-law, had offered when I struggled with the zipper. I'd hesitated but nodded, thinking nothing of it. After all, he'd always been the charming, ever-confident head of the family, a man with a magnetic presence that could command any room. But now, as his fingers worked the zipper, I became acutely aware of the intimacy of the gesture. The silence between us felt deafening, broken only by the faint hum of conversation from downstairs. I avoided his gaze in the mirror, but I could feel his eyes on me, intent, searching. "There," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. The zipper reached the top, but his hands didn't drop immediately. Instead, he adjusted the fabric at my shoulder, his fingers grazing my skin in a way that sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. I turned to thank him, forcing a polite smile, but the words caught in my throat when I saw the expression on his face. Soft, yet piercing, as though he'd uncovered a part of me I hadn't meant to reveal. "You look stunning," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just a compliment, it was something heavier, something dangerous. My heart raced as I stepped back, creating a sliver of space between us. "Thank you," I managed to reply, my voice shakier than I intended. He didn't move immediately, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer than was appropriate. Then, as though catching himself, he cleared his throat and stepped away, his confident demeanor returning in an instant. "I'll see you downstairs," he said, his voice back to its usual warmth. But as he turned and walked out, I caught the faintest glance over his shoulder, a flicker of something unspoken, and since he paused, I was sure no one would flinch away. I exhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the dresser to steady myself. What was that? A simple misunderstanding? Or was there something more lurking beneath the surface? My reflection stared back at me, my cheeks flushed, my pulse still unsteady. Downstairs, laughter erupted, a stark contrast to the turmoil I felt within. I took a deep breath and told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment, an anomaly. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The day had started like any other. The house was alive with the usual pre-dinner chaos that came with hosting Jake's sprawling family. I had barely had a moment to myself since morning, shuttling between the kitchen and the dining room, ensuring everything was perfect. Jake, my husband of 5 years, had insisted on inviting everyone over for his father's birthday, a gesture I supported, though it meant hours of meticulous planning. Jake's family was close-knit to a fault. His parents, Richard and Linda, had been married for decades, a partnership that always seemed rock solid. Richard was the kind of man who commanded respect effortlessly, tall and broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair and a natural charisma. He was a patriarch in every sense of the word, but what truly set him apart was his charm, a charm that disarmed everyone, including me. From the moment Jake introduced me to his parents, Richard had always been warm, almost overly attentive. At first, I chalked it up to his extroverted nature, the way he treated everyone as though they were the most interesting person in the room. But over time, I started noticing the subtleties, how his compliments lingered just a bit too long, or how his eyes would light up in ways that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't been in years. Jake, on the other hand, was steady and reliable, a good man. But like many marriages, ours had fallen into a comfortable monotony. Between his demanding job and my responsibilities at home, our interactions had become more functional than romantic. The little sparks that once ignited our relationship had dimmed, leaving a space I hadn't even realized was there. It was in that space that Richard's presence loomed larger than it should. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself rushing to get ready. The dress I had chosen, a sleek navy number, was one I hadn't worn in years. It hugged my figure in all the right places, a subtle reminder of the version of myself I sometimes felt I'd lost, confident, desirable, and unapologetically me. I was running behind schedule, fumbling with the zipper when I heard a knock at the bedroom door. "Everything okay in there?" Richard's voice came through, warm and tinged with humor. I froze for a moment, startled by his presence so close. "Yes, just trying to get this zipper up," I called back, my tone light but strained. The door creaked open a few inches, and he peeked in, his face a mask of concern. "Need a hand?" My first instinct was to refuse. It felt too intimate, too precarious. But the zipper was stubborn, and the last thing I wanted was to walk downstairs half-dressed, asking Jake for help. I nodded, stepping back to let him in. "Just a quick tug, and it should be fine." Yes, it should. He stepped into the room, his presence filling the space instantly. As he moved closer, I caught the faint scent of his cologne, a familiar blend of cedar and musk. It was comforting, yet strangely unsettling. He positioned himself behind me, his fingers brushing against my back as he gripped the zipper. "Hold still," he said softly, his voice close enough to send a shiver down my spine. I focused on my reflection in the mirror, watching as he worked the zipper up slowly. His touch was firm but gentle, and for a brief moment, I found myself hyper-aware of every sensation. When the zipper reached the top, his hands lingered, smoothing the fabric over my shoulders. "There," he said, his voice low. "Perfect." I met his gaze in the mirror, and for a split second, something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't just admiration. It was something deeper, something that made my stomach flutter with both excitement and dread. I turned to thank him, hoping to break the tension, but my words faltered when I saw the way he was looking at me. "You always were the most stylish one in this family," he said, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It felt like a compliment wrapped in something sharper. "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I stepped back, creating some much-needed space between us. I'd better head downstairs before Jake starts wondering where I am. Richard nodded, his expression neutral again, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of regret and restraint. "Of course, don't let me keep you." As he left the room, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My pulse was racing, my mind spinning with questions I didn't want to answer. What just happened? And why did it feel like something had shifted irrevocably? Downstairs, the house was bustling with activity. Jake was laughing with his brothers in the living room. the sound of their voices filling the space with warmth and familiarity. Linda was in the kitchen, finishing the appetizers, her usual composure slightly frazzled as she tried to keep everything on schedule. I stepped into the chaos, grateful for the distraction. But even as I mingled with the family, chatting and laughing as though nothing had happened, I couldn't shake the lingering heat from Richard's touch or the weight of his gaze. It clung to me like a shadow, a constant reminder of the moment we'd shared upstairs. As the evening unfolded, I found myself stealing glances at him, searching for any sign that he felt it too. But Richard was the picture of ease, effortlessly charming as he regaled the family with stories and jokes. If he was affected by our encounter, he didn't show it. And yet, every time our eyes met across the room, there was a spark, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of us dared to name. By the time dinner was served, I was emotionally exhausted. I tried to focus on the food, the conversation, the laughter. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything if I let it. And the most terrifying part, I wasn't sure if I wanted to pull back. The rest of the evening felt like a delicate balancing act, a performance where every word, every gesture had to be carefully measured. I stayed close to Jake, laughing at his jokes, holding his hand under the table like a dutiful wife. But my mind was elsewhere, caught in a spiral of thoughts I couldn't untangle. No matter how hard I tried to focus on the present, my attention kept drifting back to Richard, the way his touch had lingered, the intensity in his eyes. As dessert was served, Linda announced she needed help in the kitchen. Jake's sisters quickly volunteered, leaving me alone at the table with the men. Richard leaned back in his chair, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his gaze casually sweeping the room until it landed on me. I felt the weight of it immediately, a pull that was both thrilling and unnerving. "Tamara, you've outdone yourself tonight," he said, his voice smooth and steady. "Everything has been perfect." Jake grinned, patting my hand. "She always does, that's why I married her." The compliment should have filled me with warmth, but instead it felt hollow, like Jake was praising an employee for a job well done. I forced a smile, murmuring a thank you, but my focus was on Richard, who hadn't looked away. His expression was unreadable, his eyes betraying nothing, but there was an energy between us, crackling and alive. "Excuse me," I said abruptly, pushing back my chair. "I need to check on the girls in the kitchen." Jake barely glanced up, engrossed in a conversation with his brothers. Richard, however, stood as I did, a gesture that felt both gentlemanly and pointed. "Let me help you with that," he offered, his tone casual. I opened my mouth to decline, but the words didn't come. Instead, I nodded, and we walked to the kitchen together, the air between us charged with unspoken tension. Linda and the others were bustling around, laughing as they loaded the dishwater and packed leftovers. Richard and I exchanged polite pleasantries with them, but our focus was elsewhere. When Linda asked if we could take a box of plates to the dining room, Richard immediately volunteered. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the door. "I'll give you a hand." The moment we were alone again, the dynamic shifted. In the quiet of the hallway, the noise from the kitchen and dining room fading into the background, I felt the space between us shrink. He set the box on the sideboard, his movements deliberate, and turned to face me. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low, almost teasing. I folded my arms, leaning back against the wall to create distance. "I'm not avoiding you. We've just both been Busy. Busy, he repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. Is that what we're calling it? I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. I don't know what you mean. I shook. He tilted his head, his gaze piercing. I think you do. The honesty in his words was disarming, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The logical part of me screamed to shut this down, to put an end to whatever this was before it went any further. But another part, a reckless, curious part, wanted to see where it would lead. You can't say things like that, I whispered, my voice trembling. Why not? He countered, his tone gentle but firm. We're just talking. It doesn't feel like just talking. He took another step closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. Then what does it feel like? I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. I was too overwhelmed, too caught off guard by the intensity of his presence. He reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face, and the simple gesture sent a jolt through me. This, I said finally, my voice barely audible. This isn't right. No, he agreed softly. It's not. For a moment, I thought he was going to step back, to end this before it went too far. But instead, he stayed where he was, his hand lingering at my temple, his thumb tracing the curve of my cheek. The air between us was electric, charged with a tension that was impossible to ignore. I closed my eyes, fighting the urge to lean into his touch. Someone could see us. They won't, he said with quiet certainty. But if you want me to stop, say the word and I will. It was the out I needed, the escape route that would allow me to walk away with my dignity intact. But the word wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, my breath shallow, my body betraying me with its stillness. He took my silence as permission, his hand moving to the back of my neck, his touch firm yet gentle. He leaned in, his breath warm against my skin, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The world around us faded away, leaving only the two of us in this charged, precarious moment. Sound from the dining room shattered the spell, a burst of laughter, followed by the clatter of dishes. I stepped back abruptly, putting space between us, my heart hammering in my chest. I can't do this, I said, my voice shaking. He held my gaze, his expression softening. I understand. I turned and walked away, my pulse racing, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. As I re-entered the dining room, Jake looked up and smiled, completely unaware of what had just transpired. I forced myself to smile back, but inside I felt like I was coming apart at the seams. Richard followed a moment later, his composure intact, his expression unreadable. He resumed his place at the table, joining in the conversation as though nothing had happened. But when his eyes met mine across the room, the connection was still there, a silent reminder of the line we had almost crossed, and the line I wasn't sure I could resist crossing again. The rest of the evening was a blur, every interaction tinged with the weight of what had just happened. I avoided Richard as much as I could, focusing on small talk with Jake's siblings and helping Linda with the dishes. But even in the busiest moments, I felt his gaze on me, a constant reminder of the unresolved tension between us. After dinner, the family gathered in the living room for drinks and laughter. Jake had taken to entertaining everyone with stories of our recent trip to the mountains, his voice animated as he described our misadventures. I smiled and nodded in all the right places, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the hallway encounter over and over. Richard sat across the room, his posture relaxed, a glass of whiskey cradled in his hand. To anyone else, he looked perfectly at ease, the epitome of a family patriarch enjoying a quiet evening with his loved ones. But I noticed the subtle shifts, the way his eyes flicked to me when he thought no one was looking, the slight tension in his jaw whenever Jake leaned in to touch my shoulder. The unspoken connection between us felt like a thread, stretched, taut, and ready to snap at any moment. And the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it seemed to pull. "Everything okay?" Jake's voice broke through my thoughts, his brow furrowed in concern. I blinked, forcing a smile. "Of course, just a little tired." He nodded, his expression softening. "Why don't you take a break? I'll grab you a drink." I shook my head. "No, I'm fine, really. You're afraid to lose me." But the truth was, I felt anything but fine. My skin tingled with awareness, my pulse quickening every time Richard moved, every time his deep, steady voice filled the room. It was maddening, this constant push and pull, this battle between reason and desire. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure which side I wanted to win. As the evening wore on, the group began to dwindle. Linda went to bed early, exhausted from the day's preparations, and Jake's siblings started trickling out one by one, promising to call soon. By the time the clock struck 10, it was just me, Jake, and Richard left in the living room. Jake stretched, letting out a contented sigh. "I think I'm going to call it a night." "You coming?" he asked, turning to me. I hesitated, glancing at Richard. He gave no indication of interest, his gaze focused on the amber liquid swirling in his glass. Still, I felt the weight of his presence like a magnet pulling me in. "In a bit," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'll just finish cleaning up." Jake smiled, leaning in to kiss my cheek. "Don't stay up too late," he said, his voice teasing. "I might need my partner for breakfast duty tomorrow." I nodded, my heart sinking as he disappeared up the stairs. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. I turned to Richard, who was watching me now, his expression unreadable. "I should finish tidying," I said quickly, rising to my feet. "I'll help," he replied, setting his glass down. The simplicity of his statement unnerved me. There was no hesitation, no pretense. He followed me into the kitchen, his presence a constant undercurrent that made the air feel heavy. I busied myself with stacking plates and wiping counters, determined to keep my hands moving, my focus anywhere but on him. "You don't have to do this," I said without looking at him. "I'm sure you're tired." "I don't mind," he said softly. "Besides, I think we need to talk." My hand stilled, the cloth in my grip suddenly feeling too heavy. I turned to face him, my chest tightening. "About what?" "You know what," he said, his voice low and steady. He stepped closer, his eyes locking onto mine. "I can't pretend nothing happened earlier, and I don't think you can either." "Quoi. I swallowed hard, the truth of his words cutting through me like a blade. It was a mistake," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "It shouldn't have happened." "But it did," he said, his tone unwavering, "and it wasn't a mistake." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I looked away, my mind racing. "Jake is upstairs," I whispered, as though saying it aloud would somehow ground me, remind me of the stakes. "I know," he said, his voice softening. "And I don't want to hurt him, but I can't ignore what I'm feeling." "What are you feeling?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He hesitated, his expression torn. "Something I shouldn't be. something I've tried to push away, but it won't go. I shook my head, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. You don't mean that. I do, he said, his voice firm. And I think you feel it too. The silence that followed was deafening. I couldn't deny the pull between us, the way my body responded to his presence, the way my mind replayed every glance, every touch. But admitting it felt like stepping off a cliff, and I wasn't sure I'd survive the fall. This isn't fair, I said finally, my voice breaking. To Jake, to Linda, to anyone. No, it's not, he agreed. But life isn't always fair. I looked at him, my resolve crumbling. What do you want from me? Nothing, he said, stepping closer. And everything. His words sent a shiver down my spine, the raw honesty in his voice both terrifying and intoxicating. He reached out, his hand brushing mine, and the simple contact ignited something inside me, something I'd been trying to bury all night. I took a step back, my breath shallow. We can't. I know, he said, his voice heavy with regret, but it doesn't change the way I feel. The room seemed to shrink around us, the walls closing in as the weight of our emotions threatened to consume us. I didn't know what to say, what to do. All I knew was that I was standing on the edge of something dangerous, and I didn't know if I had the strength to pull back. The kitchen felt stifling, the weight of Richard's presence making it hard to breathe. I turned away from him, focusing on the dishes in the sink, desperate to busy my hands and my mind. But the sound of his voice, low and steady, cut through the silence like a blade. Do you think this is easy for me? He asked, his tone carrying a hint of frustration. I didn't plan for this, and I certainly didn't want it, but it's here, and it's real. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white as his words settled over me. I didn't trust myself to look at him, afraid of what I might see, what I might feel. It doesn't matter how real it feels, I said finally, my voice trembling. It can't happen. It can't. Why? He challenged, stepping closer. Because it's wrong? Because people would get hurt? I know all that. But do you think ignoring it makes it go away? I spun around, anger flaring in my chest. Yes, I do, because some things are bigger than us, Richard. Some lines shouldn't be crossed. And yet here we are, he said softly, his eyes searching mine. Standing on that line, pretending it's not already too late. His words sent a chill down my spine, and I hated how true they felt. The line we'd been dancing around all night had already blurred, and every glance, every word, had pushed us closer to the edge. But acknowledging it felt like surrender, and I wasn't ready to give up that fight. Not yet. You should go, I said, my voice firm, despite the war raging inside me. Jake is upstairs. Linda is upstairs. They're the people we care about, the people who trust us, and we owe them better than this. Richard's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You think I don't know that? You think I don't hate myself for even standing here, saying these things? But that doesn't change the fact that when I look at you, I feel something I haven't felt in years. His confession hit me like a blow, stealing the air from my lungs. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he didn't mean it, that it was just a fleeting moment brought on by circumstance. But I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he wasn't the only one feeling it. Richard, I whispered, my voice barely audible. This has to stop. It has to. Oh. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us. Tell me you don't feel it, he said, his voice raw with emotion. Look me in the eye and tell me I'm the only one. I opened my mouth, ready to say the words he needed to hear, the words that would end this before it went any further. But the truth lodged itself in my throat, and all I could do was stare at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. He reached out, his hand brushing my cheek, and I flinched at the contact, though I didn't pull away. His touch was gentle, almost reverent, and it sent a shiver down my spine that I couldn't ignore. "This is wrong," I said again, though my voice lacked conviction. "You know it is." Story raced through my mind. "I know," he said, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw. "But that doesn't make it any less real." My resolve crumbled in the face of his honesty, and before I could stop myself, I leaned into his touch, my eyes closing as the weight of the moment consumed me. For a brief, fleeting second, I let myself feel it, the connection, the pull, the undeniable chemistry that had been building between us all night. But the sound of footsteps on the stairs shattered the moment, and I jerked away, my heart racing. Richard stepped back, his expression shifting to one of calm neutrality as Jake appeared in the doorway, his face groggy with sleep. "Still cleaning up?" Jake asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. I forced a smile, my hands trembling as I turned back to the sink. "Just finishing up," I said, my voice too bright. "Why? Do you need something?" He shook his head, yawning. "No, just wanted to check on you. Don't stay up too late, okay?" "I won't," I promised, my chest tight as I watched him head back upstairs, completely unaware of the tension lingering in the room. When he was gone, the silence between Richard and me was deafening. I didn't dare look at him, too afraid of what I might see, of what I might feel. "I should go," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Faywit." I nodded, unable to speak, my throat tight with emotion. He moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to glance back at me. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "Not for feeling this way, but for putting you in this position." I didn't respond, couldn't respond. Instead, I listened to the sound of his footsteps fading into the night, the weight of his words settling over me like a shroud. When the door closed behind him, I sank to the floor, my body trembling with the force of everything I'd been holding back. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss. Of what? I wasn't sure. I stayed there for what felt like hours, the silence of the house pressing in on me, until exhaustion finally drove me to bed. Jake stirred as I slipped under the covers, his arm draping over me in a gesture of familiarity and love. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the evening pressing down on me like a stone. I'd made it through the night, but as I lay there, listening to Jake's steady breathing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The morning light poured through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the bedroom. Jake was still asleep beside me, his face serene and untroubled. I watched him for a moment, a pang of guilt twisting in my chest. He looked so peaceful, so unaware of the storm raging inside me. I slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake him, and padded into the bathroom. The face staring back at me in the mirror felt like a stranger's, eyes shadowed with exhaustion, cheeks flushed with emotions I couldn't name. I splashed cold water on my face, hoping to shock myself into clarity, but it did little to calm the chaos in my mind. Richard's words replayed in my head on an endless loop, each one cutting deeper than the last. I feel something I haven't felt in years. I had tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as a fleeting moment of weakness, but the truth was undeniable. I had felt it too, and that terrified me. Downstairs, the house was quiet, the aftermath of the previous night's gathering evident in the scattered plates and empty glasses. I started cleaning, hoping the familiar routine would help clear my head. But every movement, every sound, seemed to echo with memories of Richard. His voice, his touch, the way his eyes had lingered on mine, as if searching for something I wasn't ready to give.
Morning.
Jake's voice startled me, and I turned to see him leaning against the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Morning, I replied, forcing a smile. Coffee's brewing. He crossed the room and kissed my forehead, his touch gentle and comforting. You're amazing, you know that? Hosting everyone, cleaning up afterward. I don't know how you do it. I laughed softly, the sound hollow to my ears. It's nothing, just part of the job, right? Piero nodded. Jake smiled, oblivious to the turmoil beneath my words. Still, I appreciate it. We all do. As he poured himself a cup of coffee, I felt a surge of guilt, so strong it almost knocked the air out of me. Jake loved me, trusted me, and here I was, wrestling with feelings I had no right to entertain. I wanted to confess, to tell him everything, but the words stuck in my throat. Everything was. What good would it do? It would only hurt him, and for what? A moment of honesty that wouldn't change the past? The sound of the front door opening broke the silence, and I froze. Linda's voice floated in from the entryway, cheerful and bright. Good morning, lovebirds. I thought I'd come back and help clean up. May we tomorrow be the best? She asked, following me in. I snorted. Croyed. Jake smiled and went to greet her, leaving me alone in the kitchen. My hands trembled as I resumed scrubbing a plate, my mind racing. I hadn't expected her to return so soon. Hadn't prepared myself to face her after everything that had happened with Richard. She entered the kitchen a moment later, her smile warm as she hugged me. You did such a wonderful job last night. Everyone had a great time. Thanks, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't bear the thought of what she might see if she looked too closely. Richard was singing your praises this morning, she continued, her tone light and conversational. He said you were the perfect hostess. I think he's quite fond of you. The words hit me like a slap, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. That's sweet of him, I said, forcing a smile. Linda laughed, oblivious to the tension gripping me. He's always had a soft spot for you. Jake's lucky to have someone who fits so seamlessly into the family. Her words stung, a painful reminder of the line I had crossed, even if only emotionally. I nodded, unable to respond, and focused on the task at hand. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Linda and Jake kept the conversation light, filling the house with warmth and laughter. I went through the motions, smiling when appropriate, but my mind was elsewhere. Every laugh felt like a betrayal, every kind word a lie I couldn't untangle. When Richard arrived later to pick up Linda, my heart leapt into my throat. He greeted everyone with his usual charm, his demeanor calm and composed. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the flicker of something. Regret, perhaps, or maybe longing. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his easy smile, but it was enough to send my pulse racing. Thank you again for last night, he said, his voice warm and sincere. You really went above and beyond. It was nothing, I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. I'm glad everyone enjoyed themselves. As he turned to leave, his hand brushed mine ever so slightly, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through me. I pulled back quickly, hoping no one had noticed, and busied myself with cleaning up. The door closed behind him, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The air in the room felt lighter, but the weight in my chest remained. I knew I should feel relief, but all I felt was emptiness, a gnawing ache that refused to be ignored. Over the next few days, I tried to push it all aside. I threw myself into work, into my routine, hoping the busyness would drown out the thoughts of Richard that kept creeping in. But every quiet moment was a reminder, a chance for my mind to wander back to the night that had changed everything. I thought about telling someone, a friend perhaps, but the shame held me back. How could I admit what I'd done, what I'd felt? How could I explain the pull I couldn't quite resist, the connection I couldn't break? And then there was Jake. Sweet, loyal Jake, who loved me with every fiber of his being. He didn't deserve this, didn't deserve to be caught in the crossfire of my confusion. I vowed to be better, to focus on him, on us, but no matter how hard I tried, the shadow of Richard lingered, a constant reminder of the line I'd crossed and the secrets I now carried. Late one night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I could completely silence the feelings stirring inside me, but I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't let this destroy my family. I would bury it, lock it away in the deepest corners of my heart. I would smile and laugh and love Jake the way he deserved, even if it meant denying a part of myself. It was the only way forward, the only way to protect everything I held dear. But even as I made that promise, I couldn't ignore the small voice in the back of my mind, whispering a question I didn't want to answer. What happens if it happens again? The weeks following Richard's late-night confession were a delicate balancing act. Every moment felt like walking a tightrope, trying to keep my footing while the weight of guilt and longing threatened to pull me under. I threw myself into my marriage with Jake, clinging to the stability he provided, desperate to convince myself that I could move past everything that had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, Richard's words echoed in my mind, an ever-present reminder of the storm I couldn't escape. The tension came to a head one evening when Jake and I attended a family barbecue at his parents' house. The backyard was bustling with laughter and the smell of grilled food, the kind of idyllic scene that should have put everyone at ease. But as soon as we arrived, I felt the weight of Richard's presence. He was across the yard, talking to one of Jake's uncles, but his eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, and it was enough to set my heart racing. I spent most of the evening avoiding him, sticking close to Jake and immersing myself in conversations with his siblings. But the unspoken connection between us was impossible to ignore. Every accidental glance, every moment of shared silence felt like a spark threatening to ignite something far more dangerous. As the evening wore on, I slipped away to the kitchen to grab a drink. The house was quiet, a welcome reprieve from the noise outside, but as I reached for a glass, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I turned to find Richard standing in the doorway, his expression shadowed and tense. "We need to stop meeting like this," I said, attempting to inject some levity into the moment, though my voice trembled. Richard didn't smile. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low and strained, pretending everything's fine when it's not. Richard, I began, but he cut me off. No, just listen, he said, his tone desperate. I love you. I don't know how it happened or why, but I do, and I can't keep pretending I don't. His words stole the air from my lungs, and for a moment I couldn't speak. The truth in his voice was undeniable, and it mirrored the feelings I'd been fighting to suppress. But this wasn't just about us. It was about Jake, Linda, and the family we were both a part of. This has to end, I said finally, my voice firm despite the tears brimming in my eyes. It's not fair to anyone, especially not to Jake. I know, he said, his voice breaking, but knowing doesn't make it any easier. The sound of voices approaching from outside snapped us both back to reality. Richard stepped back, his expression guarded once more. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving me standing in the kitchen, my heart aching with the weight of what could never be.